Welcome back, Social 30. This is a little bonus content on elections. So this will give us an opportunity to explore some arguments that would say people shouldn't vote, and some arguments that would defend the fact that they need to vote. We'll look at things like voter fraud and some disenfranchisement. So here we go. So on the side that, you know what, people really shouldn't vote, we have some pro-authoritarian statements. And I really like this one. The main alternative to authoritarianism, liberal democracies are weak. They're inefficient. And therefore, in order to achieve the full potential of a nation, we need powerful leaders. The fragility of modern regimes is evidenced in their futile attempts to control and shape the growth of society by restricting internet use, banning demonstrations, and the right of association, or controlling judges. So that's a quick perspective, and like any perspective, you could do some A1 skills here. You know, what's the inspiration for the source? Well, the source is a part of a conversation about what is an ideal government. And it seems like the source is trying to persuade people to adopt authoritarianism. They're trying to point out the inefficiencies of liberal democracy. They use words with a lot of negative connotation like weak and inefficient. So people who value efficiency and they value strength may be persuaded towards authoritarianism. They try to say that modern regimes that are liberal are fragile and that they do futile things like attempt to control the people, and suggest that if you want to overcome a cycle of futility, then you need to embrace authoritarianism. So this would be somebody that might be supporting the one-party state system of China and attacking the divisive system of the United States. So their agenda is to convince people of authoritarianism, but there's some assumptions here. They're assuming that the central government will be efficient and that within a one-party state there won't be misdirection like we saw in Stalin's USSR and even more so in Mao's China. There's other assumptions that it links things like banning demonstrations and the right of association with liberal democracies, and it almost seems like they're suggesting that you wouldn't see that under an authoritarian state, where I'd say that under an authoritarian state you'd be even more likely to see restrictions on internet use. See China and the Great Wall of China today, or banning demonstrations or controlling judges. So some of the arguments that they use down here against modern regimes could be used even better against, authoritarian states. Now we have a quote by Adolf Hitler from Mein Kampf. Again, it's trying to attack the idea that democracies are good. So it's trying to present the idea that democracies don't work and elections don't work. So although we cannot be too sharp in condemning the absurd notion that geniuses can be born from general elections. So the first sentence is trying to say, general elections will not be able to find the best among us to lead. We cannot be too sharp in condemning it, right? So, we can be as sharp as we want. We can condemn it as much as we want. That it's an absolute statement that the geniuses will never be born from general elections, that you'll never find that great man theory of Carlyle. You'll never be able to find, in terms of meritocracy, the best to rule us out of a democracy, because in a democracy it's about popularity. It's about, appeal to the people. It's not about ability. Second sentence, in the first place, a nation only produces a real statesman once in a blue moon. So very rare, and not 100 or more at once. So if you have a Reichstag where there's, hundreds of seats, or a Canadian Parliament where there's hundreds of seats, then who's to say that there's hundreds of effective people in a country to lead? The suggestion here is that maybe you only have one or maybe just a handful of people that really have the merit to lead a country. So why decentralize power into so many incapable hands rather than centralizing power into so many capable hands? So in the first place, a nation only produces a real statesman once in a blue moon and not 100 at once. And in the second place, the revulsion of the masses for every outstanding genius is positively instinctive. So this is like that tall poppy syndrome idea that the masses don't like those who are more capable than they are, that we are jealous, and therefore we're less likely to actually elect those with the best ability to lead, because in those with more ability, we see some kind of threat, with some kind of challenge, that we're revolted by these with superior skills. So not only are we unlikely to have hundreds of capable people at once, but in an election we're unlikely to have people support them, because people in a tall poppy-like syndrome will end up being revolted. There's a revulsion of the masses for all these geniuses. Sooner will a camel pass through a needle's eye, big camel, small needle, not going to happen, it's a biblical reference too, than a great man be discovered by an election. In world history, the man who really rises above the norm of the broad average usually announces himself personally. So the greats, the Alexander the Greats, the Napoleons, they seize the stage, and Adolf Hitler, ironically, is saying that here, and it's irony because, as we know, his party will ultimately fail in their putsch in Munich, but later become more popular in the Reichstag, and he becomes chancellor when his party is the most popular in the Reichstag. So you could say that his own rise to power seems to be contrary to what he envisioned. So what is the problem that the source is presenting? The problem is that in a democracy, the people are revolted by the geniuses. That in a democracy, you're not likely to find hundreds of capable people to rule at once. The solution is authoritarianism. The means to the solution, not an election, but to allow the stage to be seized by those great men. The proponents would be your Sorels and Gentiles and Schopenhauers, your pro-authoritarian philosophers that believe that we need to submit to the supreme will of others, so like the Übermensch idea of individuals, but at the same time, of Nietzsche's Übermensch, but at the same time you've got some opponents here, and the opponents would suggest that that democracy is the only legitimate foundation of a government, and that if we have an undemocratic transition of power, it's going to be likely to be very violent. And we need democracies and general elections because it's a more peaceful transition of power from one administration or regime to another. And opponents might look back at Mein Kampf and the writing of Adolf Hitler in Mein Kampf and say, well, it's not like Hitler left Germany in a better state than what he found it. You know, he left Germany occupied and in ruins because once he was able to take authoritarian power of his country and rule in an unquestioned way, he misled his country into a very costly war that will end up dividing his country until 1989. So next up, there will be people that say, no, you know what, people should vote. And here's a good quote from Thomas Jefferson. When the government fears the people, there's liberty. When the people fear the government, there's tyranny. There's many variations on that quote, but the essence of the quote is the idea of the will of the people needs to be the foundation of government. And in a place like America, that is one of the cornerstones of the relationship between the government and the governed. And if you take away that cornerstone, if you take away the will of the people, if you take away elections, then you will take away liberty. And that is continued to much greater extent in this longer quote. The strength of any democracy depends upon citizen participation in issues of governance. So if you're breaking down the language, you'd have to ask yourself, what's an issue of governance? In a democracy, governance and attendant issues, what's an attendant issue? Are the people's responsibility? Voters have a duty to hold their leaders accountable. So it's talking about accountability, it's talking about legitimacy, talking about will of the people, talking about voting, but there's other things there too, like what's an attendant issue within a democracy. But our winner-takes-all electoral system mutes the will of all of our minorities that fall outside of major political parties, squanders votes for every candidate except the winner, and therefore encourages voter apathy. So what is the source doing? It's responding to the issue of apathy in Canada. It's the purpose of the source to try to respond to a flaw of democracy in Canada and potentially create a stronger democracy by changing the electoral system, by replacing the winner takes all, first past the post with a more democratic, more reflective system like proportional representation. And they use these quotes to things like, if you do not support the winner, then what it ultimately does is it squanders votes for every other candidate. So if in your riding you have one candidate that wins with 25%, and everyone else had 24, whatever remains, maybe I should start with 26, then a minority of people in that riding actually support the winner, and therefore the majority of the people, their vote was squandered. Or even worse, maybe if you live in a riding where you know that the Liberal or the Conservative candidate or the NDP candidate's going to win, you may decide, well, why would I even vote? My vote is not going to affect the results because the candidate that will win in this riding is going to win by so many votes. I'm not going to make a difference. So if every vote truly had equal value, and even more importantly representation, it might encourage active citizenship. So the goal is active citizenship. The problem is apathy. The solution is electoral reform, specifically proportional representation. The argument is that our current system is creating apathy, encouraging apathy, because if you are a person who identifies with a fringe party, your candidate will not be elected. If you're a person who identifies with any party, actually, other than the winner, your vote will be squandered. It will not impact on who gets to be sent to the House of Commons. So the goal is a rigorous democracy. The goal is to renew democracy, restore Canadian democracy, try to get people back involved into this political relationship with the government. And the solution seems simple. Change the way we count the votes. Why people might not vote? Well, here we got actual evidence of what that other one was talking about. So we have the 1998 Quebec provincial election, and in 1998 in Quebec, you got the Parti Québécois that they get 61% of the seats. And they actually had less votes than the second place party. The Liberal Party had more votes, but they get less seats because of the way the results are counted, because of the way the ridings, the constituencies are drawn up. So the Liberal Party is being victimized, really, right? And their supporters are being muted because of the way the votes are being counted. Even the Action Démocratique Party, they had 11, almost 12% of the vote. They got one seat. They got one seat. They had 12% of the vote. They got one seat. You can make the argument that they're actually a greater disservice is to their party than any one party. They have roughly a quarter of the vote of the other two parties. They have a lot less than a quarter of their seats. So the electoral system that we have in Canada distorts the will of the people in order to create a renewed, vigorous, active Canadian democracy. A simple solution might be to alter the way we count the votes. Maybe move towards proportional representation. It's the message coming out of there. Well, in America, they have a different problem with disenfranchisement. So Martin Luther King talked about disenfranchisement when he said to deprive man of freedom is to regulate him to the status of a thing, rather than elevate him to the status of a person. So what is the role of government? Is it to elevate those who are marginalized, or is it to relegate those who are marginalized? If there are marginalized people living within our borders, should the government try to elevate them, or should the government try to regulate them? Should they try to push down the downtrodden, or should they try to lift them up? And here we have the idea that in America, Martin Luther King is looking around and he's saying the government is potentially relegating us to the status of a thing. So a person votes, a thing doesn't get to vote. And in America, this cartoonist is saying the grand old party, the Republican Party of the United States, they've created new legislation and that's going to make it difficult for minorities to get to the polling station. So you need ID. Oh man, I don't have my ID. You don't get to vote. You need your driver's license. Oh, I don't have a driver's license. You don't get to vote. I need to see your marriage license. I don't have that. You don't get to vote. You know what? The municipal government is saying you haven't paid your gas bill. You don't get to vote. You haven't been vaccinated. You can't be here because it's unsafe for you to be here. You don't get to vote. So you could put different things on these obstacles, on these hurdles, but the information on each hurdle is meant to be linked back to legislation created by the Republican Party in the United States that is getting in the way of individuals to vote. And it's suggesting that disproportionately it's targeting minorities. That, you know, if a white guy comes here and he wants to vote, he probably has these things. So he's going to get to vote. And therefore, it's going to distort the will of the people, and it's going to give too much voice to some Americans and take away the voice of others. Same idea is being shown here. Vote here if you can afford it, because there's a poll tax. So in the history of the United States, at some times there were taxes in place that if you couldn't pay, then you would be disenfranchised. And at the time of this cartoon that Dr. Seuss made in 1942, 10 million Americans could not afford to vote. So they had the right to vote, but they just they didn't have the means to vote because there was a tax in place. And again, disproportionately, although the crowd looks very white, disproportionately the tax would have targeted people of color. So are they still trying to manipulate voters in America of 2020? As we finish the year of 2020, we can look back and, you know, the election was definitely a little muddy at times, and the results were also muddy. Well, we can see that within the United States, there were some attempts to manipulate the vote. There were some attempts to manipulate the vote, and here you have a landlord that is saying to his tenants, you know, if Biden wins, your rent's going up. So he's trying to put the pressure, the threat of rent increases upon his tenants and saying, you should go out there and vote for Donald Trump unless you want to pay more for rent. Another thing that we can look at is disenfranchising people in America today. Access to accurate IDs in states with voter ID laws. So there are some states in the United States that it's difficult or even impossible for people to vote depending upon where they're at with their gender fluidity and their transition from one gender to another. So the states shown in red, it's difficult or impossible for people transitioning to vote. And there's a link to an article there. And finally, was there election fraud in the United States in 2020? This source may suggest yes, there was. You had 32,519 more registered voters than eligible voters in Detroit alone, and 2,500 plus dead people voted. One voter, he was born before 1823 and he voted. So voting definitely needs to be examined in America.